At midday today, 2,000 firefighters, along with some 111 dispatchers across the country, will be walking off the job. They're calling for better pay, more staff, improved resources, work conditions, all this sort of stuff.
We want to signal to our employer that they need to come to bargaining. I don't think we need to do a great big long strike to do that. We need to, so we're doing a short strike. This is the beginning.
Fire and emergency is in a real dire state. We've got fire trucks breaking down on a daily basis right across the country now. We can't serve the big heavy aerials, the big ladder trucks breaking down all the time. We've got equipment that is breaking down. We've had promises from the last negotiations for an extra 230 firefighters still haven't been fulfilled by the organisation.
Promises not kept, say firefighters, and breakdowns across the entire organisation. That organisation, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, or FENZ. We've all seen the union graffiti on fire trucks and heard about the hour-long strike that stopped engines based just 7 minutes away getting to a burning school.
The fire ripped through the sport pavilion here at Northcote College on Auckland's North Shore. We've heard from a number of members of the community that it's a historically significant building, roughly 150 years old. However, Fire and Emergency say it's beyond saving.
Efforts to put out a blaze at another school were hindered because the equipment was broken.
One of the aerial trucks from Rotorua Fire Station broke down at the fire. The aerial trucks are the big fire trucks that deliver a huge amount of water from high above. So they let us put out fires safely without having to commit firefighters to those interior fire trucks. And also another report of a command unit from Tauranga Fire Station broke down on the way to the incident. So that's two specialist fire trucks that broke down on the way to the Taupo fire yesterday.
I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, what's the beef with firefighters? Why do they seem to be stuck in an endless standoff with the organisation that funds them?
Fire and Emergency and the Firefighters Union are swapping blame following a business being destroyed by a fire in Auckland this afternoon. Emergency services were called to Cortina Place in Pakuranga just after midday during an hour-long strike.
The Professional Firefighters Union has been accused of gambling with the public's safety after its members voted for more strikes. Fire and Emergency New Zealand, the organisation that employs firefighters, says it's disappointed the union continues to escalate industrial action.
Well, the reality is they're saying that they've got contingency planning in place to be able to mitigate this risk. What is it? And why has it failed?
For the union to say we have to get back around the table, we are there. We're the ones who have asked for facilitated bargaining. And we want to get resolution for our firefighters.
This organisation runs on a very fine line every day. And really the reality is that the strike exposes just how much of a fine line this organisation runs on.
There's so much to this story, and a warning, there's no happy ending.
Essentially, there's a fire truck that breaks down in New Zealand every day, probably multiple every day, and I just can't handle any more of the lies and the half-truths that are being told.
There's an issue, and there is just a lack of questions and clarity about what's going on. That's what I want to get to the bottom of.
Here are a few firefighter facts. Firefighters will attend car crashes, medical events, they're often at the scene first with their defibrillators, dig people out of landslides, rescue them from floods, secure the roofs blown off in a cyclone, run search and rescue operations, tackle hazardous materials incidents, perform cliffside rescues, put smoke alarms up, turn up at your school fair for community education sessions, get your cat out of a tree, clean and maintain the fire trucks, and put out fires. The more we're hit by big weather events, the more that other services are hit by cost cuts, the more they have to do. And now they're doing it during a major restructure aimed at cutting costs by $50 to $70 million a year, after the government refused to entertain the size of an increase in the insurance levies that funds them. That means about 150 roles gone from the service, including this one this week.
Fire and Emergency New Zealand is axed the only paid role on Aotea, Great Barrier Island. Documents seen by RNZ show the new arrangement, which is sending staff from the mainland, will cost the fire service more than retaining an officer on the island.
RNZ's Phil Pennington's been taking a special interest in this story, but when I asked him if he could see a way out, there was a big silence.
Is it on every front that you look that there seems to be an overwhelming problem or a lack or and everything compounding together, the finances, the strife, even the personal conflicts, and then, of course, climate change just bearing down on us all.
Let's start today with those graffitied fire trucks, something that most of us will have got used to seeing over the last couple of years.
Yeah, you will have seen those with the dire emergency on the trucks or on the fire station windows. In fact, it came up at Parliamentary Select Committee when some MPs said, why on earth are they allowed to do that? But the answer was from FENZ itself was, they're allowed to do that.
How long has this been going on? Is it 2 years, is that right, that they've been negotiating their pay?
Yeah, the actual strike action and the dire emergency type stuff, that's been going on since last October. But you're right, it extends way back. Bargaining began in August 2024 and they haven't had a general pay increase since July 2023.
How come? I mean, surely, is it a case of the two not meeting at all? Are they so far apart?
Well, they are, and even when they seem to veer closer together, then they break apart again. So in March, we were expecting some more bargaining talks at the end of March, but they've now split apart again. And I understand that the union is now wanting to meet with FENZ just next week to try to actually build trust into the relationship, is the way they put it. So that's how basic it is. They're saying that there's not a lot of trust there, and they're actually proposing that the two sides could adopt what Auckland Port and the stevedores did, or the Maritime Union, where they try to get the relationship on more of an even keel and then advance bargaining after that. So that doesn't look great in terms of how far along the track they are. They did, as I say, meant to be having some bargaining in late March, but then that was actually cancelled. And then you had this Employment Relations Authority finding that said that FENZ had not consulted over a restructure that they wanted to go ahead with properly. And so that's just complicated things as well.
Speaking of complications, I mean, let's lay this out from the very beginning, because I think people get confused about what FENZ is and what they do and why isn't the government funding the fire service. So can you explain the structure to me, Phil?
Yeah, so about 2016, it was the fire service and volunteers stations were all around, and the careers, but they were in two separate parts. They were separate entities. And then the legislation was changed then to bring them together. That's been a big job.
So, sorry, bring them together under the FENZ?
Bring the volunteers and the what they call career or the paid firefighters together. The numbers here are about 11,000 volunteers, about 1,800 paid firefighters, and then you've got around 1,400 support people. FENZ actually calls a large part of that enablers, which gets you away from the frontline back office thing. They insist that they're spending 90% of their money, which is about $800 million a year, on the front line. But it was a big thing, and they had to bring it together. And the legislation set out the funding, and the funding is not from the government. This is not like a government department. Nearly all of their money, in fact, all but 1% of their money, comes from insurance levies, and that's around $800 million.
So the insurance industry obviously takes a very keen interest in what's going on, because if the firefighters get what they want, that inevitably surely will mean our insurance premiums go up.
Yeah, I think the industrial fight in the context comes against in a really fraught time for FENZ. The restructure complicates it, and the restructure is largely a response to its revenues becoming more uncertain for the first time. They had wanted a levy rise. That's on like commercial property, households, that sort of thing. They sought a levy rise of over 5% to kick in from July, and the government, this is last year, said, no, you can have 2.2%. And the Minister, it's Internal Affairs, Brooke Van Velden, she basically said she wasn't convinced that they needed more money. At the same time, FENZ has found that its revenue base has become more uncertain. They said actually in their annual report, that they had expected a 13% rise in what they would get from the levy when you factored in a rise in the levy and a rise in the base number of insurance premiums it covered of households and that. But actually, they thought that would be 4% bigger, but it contracted by 1%, the number of premiums, if you like. And they said that this was last year. They said that was the first time it had declined on a year-on-year basis in almost 2 decades.
Well, so this is people realising they cannot afford insurance and taking a punt that their house won't be washed down the hill in the next flood.
Yeah, and commercial stuff contracting too, and less construction premiums as well. It's really, perfect storm is bandied about, but it is really like that. And the government also being a little sceptical about them saying they wanted more money. And so the government actually said, no, we want you to save $60 million over 3 years. And then at the end of last year, we saw that FENZ was saying that, I think in addition to that, they were going to try and save $50 million a year. And so you've got declining uncertain revenues, a cost-cutting drive that is fed into a restructure, all against the background of this industrial dispute, and then the bigger picture, which really is the question of, with climate change and floods, they are often the first responder, but can they cope as first responder? Are they going to be there when they have all these pressures on them? And that's really the background debate that's going on at FENZ.
Because they're not just the first responder for, natural emergencies and fires, obviously, but, they have defibrillators on the engines, so often they're quicker to get to a scene than ambulances when it comes to things like road crashes and heart attacks and things like that.
Yeah, medical emergencies, they get thousands and thousands of those call-outs every year, but they don't get a premium out of vehicle insurance. So you can just see there's anomalies in the way it's been set up. In terms of the Insurance Council would like it to be funded from general taxation, like a usual department. But in terms of the question of the pros and cons of that, if you have the levy system, it means that people who don't have insurance don't pay, so that's not fair. But it also means that those who have a high value property do pay a lot, and there's a fairness in that. But if you move to general taxation, it means that people with low value assets, they might end up paying as much as the people with high value assets. So there's unfairness whichever way you go.
But couldn't there be a case where the government just looks at it again and says, we've given you all these extra tasks, at the same time we want you to cut costs. Okay, we'll change our mind, we'll put in a few $100 million extra.
Ask Nicola Willis facing down a budget with it in the middle of the Iran war.
But this is a fire service, Phil.
Yeah, and when you look at what their core business is, they are responding to almost 80%. Their targets are to get to a fire in the city within 8 minutes and in the countryside with a volunteer crew within 11 minutes. And they're almost on target. They're slightly under the 80-85% target. So their core business, they're getting done. But then, of course, we hear about the fire trucks breaking down. The fire trucks, of course, get a lot of news and have sparked a parliamentary inquiry into the fleet. Context there, of course, you've got to remember that they have over 1,000 vehicles, although many of those are small utes, not fire trucks as such. And also they do go to thousands and thousands of jobs. So the breakdowns are very high profile, but they obviously do have a big problem. They've admitted that.
Here's Megan Stifler, the Deputy Chief Executive Operational Response at FENZ, speaking to TV3.
When FENZ was formed 8 years ago, we inherited a very old fleet. We don't argue that. And since it came into fruition, FENZ has replaced 317 of its appliances. We've got another 60 on track now to be delivered, and we've got $20 million being invested every year for the next 3 years. So with a 10-year asset management plan, investment in fleet, New Zealand should know that we are addressing this issue, but it will take some time.
They said in the select committee last month, hey, we just do not have enough money to do some sort of general overhaul of the fleet. We've got about 25 million a year that we spend updating the fleet. But then when you listen to that, you go, okay, so that's on the give them a break side. But on the, well, can you give them a break? They were told to do a strategy about where to put the really big trucks with the ladders. They're called aerials. They were told to do a strategy on that after the Auckland Convention Centre fire. So that was back in 2019 was the fire. 2020 they said, do this. They haven't done a strategy yet. They've been working on it since then or not working on it. It's just stalled, delayed. We keep asking and we haven't seen one. Yeah, very difficult situation for them, I think made more difficult by them.
The fire service's shortcomings affect everybody, don't they? You see farmers getting worried that now that more land is being put into forestry, that volunteers are kind of responsible for responding to forest fires.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on the volunteers, and they're sort of like the unheard from party here, really. A lot of those volunteers, of course, are very, very keen, and they do get some training. I mean, some questions we've been asking around the training for them include, how much landslide training have they had? Because they were a key part of being called out in the floods where we had the Mount Maunganui landslide. Further north in Coromandel, I think the Tairua volunteers played a big part there. And I think it went very well. But FENZ really, their dedicated training on landslides is a 20-minute module, which doesn't sound a whole lot. They have other safety stuff. So the volunteers are sort of unsung, are pretty much unheard from, although we've had stories, for instance, them trying to get coverage from ACC for PTSD and the things they have to see when they go to road accidents. And there's things like that you look at and you think, well, you sort of wonder why they don't have that coverage.
Yeah, I mean, look at the Auckland floods now, 2023.
An investigation into the death of 2 volunteer firefighters at Muruwai has found Fire and Emergency NZ failed to identify landslides as a hazard that could put its crews at risk.
That was when they brought in that landslide training module. They had an inquiry into that. It found that they basically were not training their people at all on landslides. That really raised some questions that, to my mind, have still not been answered or properly grappled with about FENZ's responsibilities around those fatalities.
Phil says there are some really tricky issues centred around volunteers, including them attending incidents that FENZ has not trained them for, such as water rescues. The question for the whole brigade has become, how much are they expected to do? This was also an issue bothering the head of FENZ, Kerry Gregory.
What he actually said in a memo that we uncovered just prior to the restructure in November, he said, we can't keep doing everything for everybody. We can't keep doing everything for everybody. And then he said, and that's not a bad thing. And then he announced this significant drive to be more efficient. But if you're a firefighter with a dire emergency sign on the door and the union sitting in behind that, you hear that, you're probably pretty worried, right?
Yeah, I mean, the police have said something similar with their refusal to turn up to, certain mental health call-outs and stuff. Yeah. Is the fire service taking a leaf out of their book?
When I went to them about what he had said there, which was behind closed doors, that we can't keep doing everything for everybody, they said, oh, no, that doesn't apply to actually firefighting. They said, because the documents also said that they were going to look at stopping or slowing activities. This was in the context of wanting to save $50 million a year, stopping or slowing activities. That was in black and white in a quote, but they came back to me and said, oh no, core duties like firefighting and additional duties under the Governing Act, such as responding to medical emergencies, rescuing people in floods, were not part of the changes. Again, take them at their word, that's going to take incredibly good management of this restructure in a hotly disputed industrial environment to deliver this wider range of services while also saving money.
The pay system's been mucked up as well, as if they didn't have enough problems. There's been this has been going on for a while. Yeah, well, yeah, it's overtime essentially. And that, if you go to the fire services website, they're advising their members not to sign anything that gives FENZ the right to deduct overpayments from their wages.
Of course, with the Holidays Act, you've had thousands of businesses and government agencies that have had trouble with that and have overpaid or underpaid, particularly underpaid people. You've had a couple of $1 billion across hospitals that the Holidays Act mucked up. That's going back, the last decade or so.
Yeah, and I guess with firefighters doing shift work, that's going to be exacerbated.
Yeah, the more shift work, the more weekend work you have allowances, that becomes messier and messier. It's interesting, though, that if they're only grappling with that now, because, Health New Zealand started grappling with that in, 2017, and they're still going, so it can be really, really hard to unpick. And then, in many cases, actually paying people stuff that they should have got in the first place. And, they said that they're offering a pay deal of, I think, 6.2% over 3 years, and that the union wants 3 times as much. But if you get into the figures of that, you get into a very fraught area where, for instance, FENZ likes to say that what they're offering would give average senior firefighter about $90,000 a year, give or take, but that they can get almost $40,000 a year in allowances on top of that. I have people like emailing me when I do stories going, oh, the firefighters, they're all moonlighting as plumbers anyway, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's always that, how it is. But then you ask yourself, at what point do you say, well, we don't need you to be on overtime. We don't actually need you to cover that shift. You can not do that and you can go home. And then there's a fire and then it's, then you need them there. So it's just one of those things where it's a what if job, really, isn't it? You don't ever want a fire, but if you have one, they've got to be there. Which often they're not. I don't know if we've got onto the fleet yet, but of course the fleet gets to the fact that they have had those breakdowns where they haven't been able to get there. I mean, the Taupo College one was a classic where they called in the big aerial ladder truck from Rotorua. It got there, and this is while the college was burning, and the pump that failed on the truck, and they only got a dribble out the end, so they had to call another one from Hamilton 2 hours away. But meantime, the firefighters, a witness talked about them looking really sad, frustrated and angry at this. And a firefighter I talked to, I put his name to it at the time, he said it was also more dangerous because they had to get closer to that. They were trying to keep the fire away from burning the library, and they succeeded, but they had to get closer to the flames than they would, of course, if they'd had the ladder working.
An increasing number of headlines on the service's fleet failures have bled through into Parliament.
The firefighters have got equipment issues, I think we all know that. So a Parliamentary Select Committee is launching an inquiry. Trucks are breaking down on the way to emergencies. Tim Costley is the National MP leading this particular one. He's with us.
There's an issue and there is just a lack of questions and clarity about what's going on. That's what I want to get to the bottom of.
Will you be able to?
Well, you think so. They're not difficult questions, right? Like if you take the last 35 trucks that got bought, I asked, 18 months ago, how many of them are in use? I got told it's the majority. I found out a few months later the answer is actually 0. So I asked again at the start of this year, well, how many is it now? I got told 14. Guess what? Turns out the answer is actually 0. So I said, well, hang on a minute.
It's Tim Costley and Mike Davison of the Greens, but Tim Costley National, he made his real job to say, how is this fleet going? And over a series of select committee hearings when he was asking FENZ, the top guys in FENZ, Kerry Gregory, Megan Stifler, others, what is going on with your fleet, and particularly 30 trucks that have had a fraught history. And he says he got such varied information from them that he found it misleading, to the point that he called for an inquiry, and so did Mike Davidson of the Greens. And that inquiry has now begun into the fleet. Submissions closed on April the 30th. I understand, the likes of the union will be going there. The union will be asking the inquiry to come up with a recommendation for another inquiry into FENZ as a whole. Don't know how many inquiries you can afford to have. But that's the state. So the fleet problems, they've landed at Parliament's door.
That's it for today. The Details, the newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and Shalise Tansey and engineered by Mark Chesterman. Thanks to Phil Pennington. I'm Alexia Russell. Mā te wā.